Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great honor. When we see something, we observe something, our mind necessarily creates a mental representation that captures the important sensory information, support further perception, decision making, and action. However, we're never blank slate. Our priors, our categories affect the way that we perceive the objects right in front of us. And this experience is playing definitely a big role also in auditory perception, as we all discussed in the past 2 days. However, internal representations are challenging to study because they are high-dimensional, complex, and rich, and they depend on culture and experience. So my works try to use different methods, including comparative cross-cultural research, which will be the focus of this talk, new behavioral methods, extending classical psychophysics, and massive global online experiments in order to understand those relation between experience, exposure, and internal representations. So today I'll talk about 2 case studies, one of them about musical rhythm, and one of them about pitch and melody. And I'm going to start with musical rhythms. So musical rhythm are really good, and we've already heard yesterday about how they let us move, and so we can dance to musical rhythm, we can engage with them, but we don't have very good vocabulary to describe them unless we're professional musicians. They are just kind of this thing that we feel, and so what we're trying to do in this talk is to understand how they're representing our mind, somehow pull from the minds of the participants their representation, and we don't want to use words because people are just not good at describing them in words. So how are we gonna do this? So the trick here comes from a game that all of us play as children, and this is the game of telephone. In the game of telephone, one person says a word whispered to another person, that person whispered to another person, and so on. And the fun in the game that even if you start with an obscure word, you end up with a banal word. And this is because every time there's a chance, you will not report what you exactly heard, but what you think that you heard. So as the chain progresses, things becomes more and more expected. Now, Tom Griffith and his students realized that there is a mathematical link between this process and a process from statistical physics and machine learning called Gibbs sampling. Basically, this game converged to the prior over the relevant domain. So under certain mathematically verifiable conditions, what we get is the game converged to distributions that represent our expectations or our priors. And the point here, intuitively it's very clear because what happens is you become more and more expected, but the point here is the mathematically direct link between this and priors. Now I know that it sounds a little bit abstract, so we're gonna make the task we actually made in the experiment right now. There's one single instruction in the task, and the instruction is to tap along the rhythm that you're hearing, okay? So let's do all it, tap on your lap, and you'll hear the sounds. Let's see that you can do it. Great, so you can do it, so are all our participants around the world. But now comes the big trick. In the actual experiment, we'll take the reproduction of the participants, average them over the repeated pattern, and create a new rhythm which is identical to the reproduction. Just like in the game of telephone. Now the participants are gonna tap again with the repeated rhythm, and they again will do it a couple of times. And just like in the game of telephone, every time there's a chance that you're a little bit more and more biased towards your expectation, so in the end, we'll be able to reveal your expectation by looking at the emergent pattern. Participants are not aware to the manipulation. They often report that the rhythm is repeated. Sometimes they say it becomes easier. And they're very shocked that when we tell them in the end, they basically played the game of telephone with themselves. Okay, so in order to understand the results, I'm going to show you the space of rhythm that we explored. This is the 3-interval rhythm pattern. You already heard it in a repeated manner, but just going to isolate you the pattern. So in this case, there were 500 millisecond, 500 millisecond interval, and a third interval with a 1,000 millisecond interval. And the rhythm is described in ratios 1, 1, 2, because the third interval was twice as long as the first and second. Because our simple integer ratios, they're nicely represented in a musical notation like this one over here. But, of course, we can think conceptually of all the continuum of other rhythms that are not integer ratios. Those rhythms can be represented in a three-dimensional space where the x and y and z coordinates are the first and second and third interval respectively. So there's an entire continuum of those rhythms. And if you look at the rhythm that spans a constant duration, then they form a triangle in this space, and we can rotate this triangle and make a two-dimensional maps of all possible rhythms. Now, the exact mathematical details are not important. What's important here is that every point on the space of triangle represents uniquely a rhythm, and every rhythm, as long as it spans a constant duration, is represented on that map directly. So it's an entire perceptual space. And things that are meaningful, like this pattern that we just played you, 1-1-2, which is very common in a lot of Western musical songs, like Jingle Bells. These patterns are somewhere in this triangle, right there, and then a pattern like 3-3-2, which is, you can see here, which is very common in Afro-diasporic music and jazz. It's also somewhere in the triangle. And a pattern like 2-2-3, which is not common in Western music, but it's common in like Balkan music. It's somewhere else. But the important thing is that instead of this, a part of these integer ratios, there's a continuum of all other possible rhythms. So in the experiment, we present all possible randomly uniformly sampled from this triangle, and I get to show you very quickly what a given participant did in the experiment. So it was presented with one point in that space, and then they did something. So it's not quite accurate. And in fact, the response of the participants when presented on the triangle are located somewhere here and displaying a big perceptual bias. Now comes a big trick. We are taking this as a new stimulus and now present it again to the participants, and let's see what they did now. That's a little bit better, and it's still biased, and now it's going to this place on the triangle, and now this becomes a new stimulus, and the fourth and the fifth iterations kind of converge. Let's listen to the pattern that they converge after the fifth and final iteration, which is unsurprisingly this 1-1-2 pattern that we just heard in the beginning. So the jingle bell pattern. Okay? So we will repeat this for one participant multiple times and then for multiple participants multiple times. Now I'm going to show you the aggregated results from 26 participants in Boston. Initially, all the seeds were uniformly randomized from this space of possible rhythm, but after 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 iterations, a very nice pattern emerged, right? So there's like hotspots of activation. So to better understand them, we perform kernel and density estimate to look at the underlying distribution, and let's focus on the fifth and final iteration. So these are empirical data from 26 participants in Boston, and you can see that the responses cluster on those beautiful hotspots. These are categories of intense activation, and then the rest is basically less active. There's not much of a response. So to better understand those hotspots, let's overlay on top of them the integer ratio that are common in Western music. These are participants from Boston, right? So here is the empirical result of the experiment. Here are the integer ratio from Western music. Here are the empirical result. Here are the integer ratio. So clearly the beautiful overlap between those integer ratios and the empirical results. So patterns like 1-1-2 that is common in a lot of children's songs are big attractor, a big category. And a pattern that is not common in Western music, like 2-2-3, is absent from this distribution of those participants, and this is consistent with some music cognition research prior to us. So the next step was, as you heard, was to go to work with the Chimane, who are, as Melinda told you, are indigenous populations from the Amazon. And by the work of Melinda, you're already motivated to look at their representation in terms of the rhythm, because we know that they differ from Western representation in a number of other aspects of auditory perception. Okay, so here are US participants, and here are the Chimane. US participant, Chimane. So there are clear differences, but some similarities. So for the similarity, the ratios that they produce are still integer. However, the difference is the weight that those integer ratio categories emerge. So, for example, 1-1-2 pattern here is stronger in the Chimane, but the pattern of 3-3-2 is nearly absent in the Chimane and is very present in the US participants. Okay? Another interesting thing is that the shape of the categories are a little bit different. And another thing that is very similar across those groups is the emergence of categories. We talked about yesterday and today about how categories are important, and you see how they are really, really crucial to this representation that they have. Okay, but that's just 2 cultures. So the next step was to collaborate with 34 other collaborators from around the world. And we went to recruit 39 groups in 15 countries and over nearly 1,000 participants. And we specifically recruited multiple groups from each country. For example, we recruited non-musicians, musicians who play Western musical styles, musicians who play local musical styles like Uruguay candombe and Malian djembe music, dancers in Uruguay and Bulgaria that plays local traditional styles, and students, population, and online participants with another technology we developed to run those experiments online. But most of these are face-to-face sessions, and I recruited data from 5 countries. All right, so, and a lot of collaborators. So what you get is a lot of triangles. And so I just want you, eyeballing those triangles, you immediately see the strengths of categorical perception. Every single location, so significant hotspots of categories that really emerge and restructure the representation. The other thing that is a bit harder to see here is that the integer ratio, those white crosses here, overlap the categories in every single country in a significant way. So both integer ratios and categorical perceptions to be universal features of this organization across locations that we studied. However, there are large cross-cultural differences. So this is data from don't participate in China, and you see the strongest category is 2 to 3. 332 is absent. In Sagale village in Mali, it's the opposite. 2 to 1 is absent, and 332 is the strongest category. In Bolivia, both of these categories are absent, but in Bolivia and in all of those places, the 1-1-1 pattern, which is the isochronous pattern, and the 1-1-2 pattern that we've seen from the children's song, they are present here and everywhere around the world. So now, to better understand the variability, what we could do next is project those triangles into a multidimensional scaling in a way that pixel-wise distances are now translated in this space to Euclidean space. So you immediately see something very interesting. Student population, who are here in light blue, are in the boring center. They just underrepresented massively the cross-cultural variability, and it didn't help that we recruited students from like Japan or Korea, or I don't want to offend anybody, but it doesn't help. Now, online participants are equally bad in the boring center, and that's bad news for us because this is the typical participants that we recruit for our experiments. And if you ask yourself why they're so similar to one another, one explanation is listening behavior that we made, and we just asked them what they listened to, and you kind of see that they listen to similar music. And I remember going from like Bolivia to Uruguay to Mali and asking students what they listened to, and then they were saying Rihanna. And you can see how long it took us to publish the paper. Okay, so, however, this extreme or cross-cultural variability that we see in non-student population is very interpretable. It's related to one category, 332, that nearly absent in some groups and very strong in other groups. And this has a really interesting musical correlate. So this category is a very common feature of Afro-diasporic music. It's called it's part of the clave pattern. It's also a very prominent feature of African music. So actually this pattern showing up, especially in the musician groups, reflects this transition, historical transition of musical structure across slavery. And what's cool about it, that we can actually find it in the minds of our participants, this story. Okay, so one thing that people often say about music and language, that they are interconnected. We didn't find any evidence for this in our data. Here is the counter evidence. For example, US musicians and non-musicians and Korean musicians and non-musicians have very similar triangles, despite speaking different languages. And we also saw the reverse. So we recruited participants from student population from La Paz, and then traditional participants from another part of the same city. And they have very different listening habits, but also different triangles. But importantly, they kind of speak the same sets of languages, predominantly a lot of Spanish. Most of them are Spanish speakers. And so they live in the same city, but their mental representation is quite different. Okay. So to summarize, large cross-cultural variabilities, There's interpretable distances, and they're related to music, not to language. And there's two universal features that seems to be very important: categorical perception and simple energy ratios. So this kind of asks the question, when are these representations learned, when they get to us? So together with my colleagues Laurel Train and Erin Hannon, we recruited a larger group of nearly 100 children, and we ran the experiment, and we found that children have a little bit simplified compared with the adults, but quantitatively quite similar representations. And this is in contrast to cross-cultural variability, which is much bigger. So this suggests by the age of 6, it's already game over, and people are fully enculturated, at least in the rhythm case. Now, one thing I want to mention, the relevance to cognitive neuroscience and neuroscience in general. So Silvino's Redan lab has two posters that you can see around this seminar, this workshop, that kind of looked into the neural correlates of this space. And they found in the EEG signal very interesting neural correlate that kind of uses our idea of this looking at those spaces, and they found the neural signatures, and you can go to their poster and listen to this very interesting work. Okay, so now I want to spend the last few minutes between us and dinner to talk about pitch and melody, and Melinda mentioned a little bit of this, but I could get to a little bit more details. So when you think about a Western piano, it kind of have some feature of Western music. It kind of manifests some feature of Western music. So first thing, the obvious thing is they're discrete keys that represent keys and scales, okay? Another thing, that the keys are not organized randomly. They're organized in an octave structure. We talked about it also already. So if you listen to tones that separates by an octave, that's somehow similar together, and this is the pattern of the keys on the piano. And this manifested in this shepherd's helix, where tones that are separated by an octave are closer together in this helix representation. Otherwise, it's pitch height that determines the location on the helix. Okay, so we want to understand these kind of things from the minds of participants across cultures. How are we going to do this? Well, I think you know the trick. The trick would be to use singing. Singing is something that we found in every culture in the world. We actually did a paper to show that. And singing is something pretty intuitive. So let's do the task, the singing task. I'm not going to prime you to the result, but I'm going to play you two tones, 1 and 2. And then you're going to sing it back in your comfortable singing range. The tones are well above your singing range, but you're just going to sing it in your singing range, okay? Let's try. Great. All right, so you can do the task. We can do it in the lab. Here is it in Boston. Okay, this is the participants in the Chimani village. And you can do it online with the technology we developed with my former postdoc, Manuel Anglada Tort. So, first thing I want to tell you about singing, that people are very good at singing, okay? There is a debate about this in the literature, but I show you evidence. I show you evidence why is the case. So, you remember those two tones that you sang? Now, one thing we can look at, which is the classical thing to look, is the interval of reproduction. So if those tones were sang in a particular interval, would people reproduce this interval? So this is one version of it. This is like the most similar to psychophysics, just direction accuracy. So people's direction accuracy, whether they sang in the same direction, is nearly ceiling for musicians in this particular case. And it's pretty good for non-musicians, and is also good for the Chimane participants in red. And it replicates also online. Okay, and it's not just the direction. You can see that their intervals are actually pretty accurate, and there are several measures that we can do it as well. So basically, people are good at singing. Now, given that people are good at singing, we now can ask whether they're good at replicating the chroma, or the respecting octave equivalence. That's the trick here, because when they sing these high tones, if they transpose it to their singing range, respecting octave equivalence, they're going to transpose over by a number of required integer octaves. But if they don't respect octave equivalence, they're going to encode the interval, the correct interval. We already know it's going to approximately correct. It's going to be shifted to some random location. Okay? So by looking at the difference between the response to the stimulus in terms of the pitch of the anchoring the first tone, we are able to know whether they respect octave equivalence or not. So that's what we did. We looked at the stimulus and response difference, and 0 means here respecting octave equivalence. And what we saw that musicians respect octave equivalence most of the time. Non-musicians do it some of the time, but still highly, highly significant. So this is the light blue here. This is musician in blue. And the cimane are basically a chance. They anchor the tones, they sing the correct interval, but they anchor tones completely randomly. And you can hear it in the single trial that I played. So this suggests that octave equivalence is culturally contingent. Okay? That attracts a lot of fire. So I want to mention some of the control experiments that are required here. For example, we altered the timbre, and there was the idea that if the timbre plays a big role, then it will be kind of sensitive to timbre. There's no sensitivity to timbre whatsoever. The other thing is we did the perceptual experiments. We used a clever design by Demani and Armand. And what they did was just perceptual experiment only, so there's no production involved. We found that those two tasks were correlated, but we found that if anything, the singing experiment is much more stronger in terms of the effect size, so it's more sensitive than the perceptual only experiments, and we have a follow-up paper on this upcoming in the next few weeks. All right, the other thing is, maybe they just didn't get the task. So to do that, we provide feedback after every single trial. Every single trial they got feedback, so maybe they coach towards understanding their right representation if they get feedback every trial. It didn't help at all, and actually it didn't help also Western participants. Feedback doesn't change their representation. It's not just doesn't help. Okay, so I want to finish, or nearly finish, by talking about some new results we got from Bolivia. So these are we just came back from the summer working there with Sophia, which is there somewhere in the audience. And what we did is collected data from small children. And the interesting thing is children really liked the task, and they were able to concentrate almost like the adults, and they were able to perform in terms of direction, accuracy, and other measures very near to the adults, okay? However, as you might expect, and a little bit against some of the literature, they don't have magically this octave equivalence ability in their childhood. And then we replicated this already also with children from the Bayaka group in Congo, together with Daniel Haun and his students. So that is not only the cimane. And however, children from the UK show a very, very big octave equivalence. And they do that nearly about the same rate as non-musicians in adults population that we tested. So this suggests that octave equivalence can be acquired at pretty early age and is already influencing that representation. Okay, so to summarize, we can learn about pitch representation from singing, and people are pretty good at that task, and we can learn about octave equivalence, which we claim is culturally contingent. So before I finish, I want to tell you something that you may be expecting is that given that we've done all this iterated learning with tapping, we may do iterated learning with singing, okay? So it's exactly what we did. So this is a task that my former postdoc Manuela Gladator developed. And in this task, participants online are hearing a melody, and then they reproduce the melody. And then it's transformed to another participant in this case, who sings the melody back and so on. And so let's listen to the one trial, just to get you. So this is a stimulus. Ta, ta, ta. Ta, ta, ta. Ta, ta, ta. Ta, ta, ta. Okay, so you see that the random melody transformed to a pretty nice major triad. And so again, it's just like the rhythm before. We have an abstract stimulus space that we continuously sample from. The space is the space of 3 tones, and there are 2 intervals. X-axis is one interval, Y-axis is the other interval. And again, we sample randomly, uniformly from this space. And initially, in this iteration, things are pretty blurry and random. Then after a few iterations, about 10 iterations, it consolidates to those beautiful clusters. And a cluster represents, you heard, like things like a major triad, da, 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 or a fifth going up and down. So things that are building blocks of Western music. Now, we are now working on this further, but we try to run this across cultures. So we run it with participants from the US, and we now try to run it with participants in India online. So based on the rhythm results that I showed you, which I talked to you, that everything is boring in online cohorts, we would expect that we also see similar no cross-cultural differences for Indian participants online. But that's not what we found. We actually found quite substantial cross-cultural differences, even in online cohorts. And that suggests that potentially melody and rhythm, the different components of musical priors, behave differently across cultures. And this is something we're now investigating by scaling up those singing experiments, both in the domain of large-scale online experiments and with collaborators around the world in small-scale societies. So to summarize, I try to show you how new behavioral methods, including online and field experiments, can shed light on fundamental questions about perception of music and their underlying cognitive neural mechanism. I think it's important for this very, very important question of nature versus nurture, but also for me more important, we understand the nature of these internal representations and have hope to understand also their neural and cognitive underpinnings. Thank you very much. I want to thank everybody involved in this global collaboration around the world. This is people who worked on the singing experiment, including Melinda McPherson here, and Josh McDermott, who was very important for both works. And this is the team from this year in Bolivia. And I want to mention that I am recruiting students and postdocs, so be in touch if you're interested. And finally, that everything that I showed is open source and available for you to use as a tool, and you can download those tools and use them in your experiments. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Nori. Fantastic overview again. Some short questions. Robert? Nori?
Thank you, Nori. That was great as usual. I'm just wondering what your take is on the octave aspect, because you've shown that it's culturally contingent in the sense that in one group you get this effect and the other you don't. But that still doesn't tell us what the sort of underlying prior might be, because I don't think you're saying that the octave relationship is a completely arbitrary cultural artifact, or are you?
So I'll tell you what I think happens is that, first of all, in the environment, in our acoustics, there's a lot of information about octaves, right? So there's no doubt about it that octaves are important.
Yeah, exactly.
And we know that from across cultures, octave appears in many, many cultures and important, either melodically or in the way that people coordinate their singing. So there's no doubt about it. But the question whether this part of our salient perceptual aspect. And I want to tell you a little bit of what is a Chimane church service, which is very important to their behavior. So you'll see that they sing together in this occasion, but they don't sing together in a unison. So let me play you what they did. So they sing together, but the actual pitch doesn't seem to be very important. And the thing is, to me, I grew up in Jerusalem, and I went to synagogues, and they just sing like that. This was very familiar to me when I've heard it, because that's exactly how would you sing in a synagogue. And these kind of clusters of tones, where the contour is important, but not so much the absolute pitch, is way more wider accepted when we think about amateur choirs, think about singing in your birthday party. You'd always hear those tone clusters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was
So that's what I think
Yeah.
happens, that the people just downplay this.
sure. I was once a church organist, so I know about singing like that. But that actually doesn't explain why the octave is so widespread.
Because it's
sort of the
available in the
opposite. You're
acoustic.
saying it shouldn't be so widespread, but in fact it is.
Yeah, it is available in the acoustic as a cue, and with Melinda we actually showed that there are ways in which they can sensitive, for example, to fusion cues. Just like Westerner, they're sensitive to those cues. So it's not that they're blind to those cues, but what you see here, this is the meaningful experience. So if it's not in the meaningful experience, then it eventually decays as perceptually silent cue. That's my interpretation.
How's your arm, Shihab?
So, are there any instruments or similar things in the Chimani culture that have a range over an octave? And I mean, that's
So
and out of the hundreds of other cultures that you looked at, is there a single other one similar to the Chimani?
Yeah, so we have a replication of the data in both children and adults in Congo. And
Do they have
no
instruments and also?
they do have singing and instruments that ranges over an octave. So that's in the Bayaka case, it's very interesting. What I want to say about the Chimane, we did identify some of their instruments, and it is true that their singing range, both in the Christian version that I showed you from the churches, also the traditional Chimane music, is very limited in its frequency range. So they don't sing much wider than an octave. But it's not that octaves doesn't exist in their singing, especially these are Christian songs, it's just it doesn't use to be equivalent class.